Uh, Hi, everybody. We're here with Edith Lando today. Shannon Letty will be talking to us a bit about two chapters from Me Artsy, one on the Haida manga chapter and by Michael Ulagunas, and the other one by Steve Teakins on drumming. Shannon Letty is a Métis professor at UBC. She teaches in the pedagogy. Which department are you in, Shannon? I always forget.
Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy.
Department of Curriculum and Pedagogy. Thank you so much. And we're really excited to hear a bit about what she has to say about these two chapters. And there's a couple articles that we have as resources as well, such as the one by Susan Dion, Disrupting the Mold of Images.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nora Tansei, Nitseka-san, Shannon Letty, Neochi, Vancouver, or Neochi, Saskatoon, Egwa, Vancouver. My name is Shannon Letty. I'm a member of the Métis Nation, as Nora said, and I'm originally from Treaty 6 territory in Saskatoon. And today I've lived on as an uninvited guest on the traditional and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam speaking Musqueam people, as well as the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations since 1994. And that's where I'm speaking to you from today. And I'm really delighted to be able to share some of this work with you. It's not really my work. You've read other people's work, which is great, but it's sort of part of the work that I do in terms of working in the area of Indigenous education, curriculum and pedagogy in particular, and also in terms of thinking about what does it mean to decolonize the way we think about teaching and learning? What does it mean to decolonize our curriculum? What does it mean to decolonize our pedagogies? And I think those are all, we all stand at various places when it comes to those issues. And some of us are new to these discourses, and some of us have lived them our entire lives. And some of us are sort of midway between picking them up and hopefully not putting them down. But the articles that were chosen for today's book club were actually part of a syllabus for a graduate course that I teach called Indigenous Visual Expression as Pedagogy. And it builds on my own background in art history, where I worked a lot with thinking about where does Indigenous artists belong, or where does Indigenous art belong, and who are Indigenous artists. And then further on my dissertation work, which was about how do we use contemporary and identity-based art by Indigenous people in order to open up decolonizing and anti-colonial dialogues. So when I read Me Artsy by Drew Taylor a number of years ago, just after it came out, there's so many reflections from artists across Canada in that book that I love it so much because some of the most common discourses, of course, around Indigenous people right now have to do with reconciling truth and reconciliation. And so they have a lot to do with trauma and with Indigenous people as, in these roles as victims. So one of the suggested readings for today was also Susan Dion's Disrupting Molded Images, where we unpack what are those sort of chronic stereotypes around Indigenous people that are usually linked to being romanticized, being militarized, being victimized, or being, dying out. So and these are some of the things that I want to move away from when I work with Indigenous art and artists, because those are opportunities to celebrate our survivance, our creativity, the way that we thrive in the face of the trauma we may have endured, and the way that we are still persistent peers in the present who have something to offer, who are in many cases internationally celebrated. And so it sort of balances those victim discourses, which are still important. The truth has to be told. We have to hear those stories. But I think we also have to be able to recognize Indigenous people as fully formed, as having senses of humor, as having, all of like the full breadth of the humanity that everyone else is also entitled to. So I'm super pleased that this book club has come together, and really honored to have been asked to participate in it. And I'm curious. I mean, we sort of started talking a little bit about the Susan Dion article just before we were, ready to jump in. Laura, you were talking about the fact that that's an important place for you to start in terms of your thinking about, especially new immigrant teachers, and how do we address indigeneity with people who are new here. So I wonder if you could just summarize your comments earlier. Sorry about that.
There might be different comments. I'm just
Sure.
right. So the perfect stranger idea, right? And perfect is kind of a positive connotation. I don't think here it's that positive, but I think to me, stranger, it speaks, whether it's perfect or not, it speaks to like newcomer teachers, myself included, you know, when we come here and we teach, first of all, unless the school you work with is asking you to, or the curriculum you have to follow incorporate indigenous, then you have to do some work on your own, and you need someone to introduce you to this. So whether you think of yourself as a stranger, be that perfect or not, I think there needs to be a starting point, right?
Especially for newer Canadians who have not grown up with these discourses, or don't have a good sense of Canadian history. How do you begin to put the pieces together? And even whatever you might be learning in school, there's also those informal discourses, like what are media representations, or what are the casual conversations that that you have, or what are some of the stereotypes that regularly get tossed around, and how do you stand in relationship to those ideas, and who helps you figure that stuff out. So and again, that's where I think the work of art and artists is super helpful and important. So the two articles that we chose from the book are the one about drumming by Steve Cheekins, who is an Anishinaabe. I think he's Anishinaabe. I should probably know that off the top of my head, shouldn't I? But I believe he's an Anishinaabe artist who lives in Ontario and is also does social work. And then the other one is I think a really interesting addition, because it's a graphic essay by Michael Nicolayagalanis. So very little text. And I can imagine that people feel thrown quite in at the deep end when they read that essay. I think I've had that reaction from students in my class, like, wait, what? A, it's like 8 to 10 pages, so it's really short. And B, what am I supposed to be working with here? So I'm quite keen to hear some responses to that. But I noticed that Anna Nielsen has joined us, and she is one of the star students who offered a presentation on Michael Nicolayagalanis. So we'll let her get settled and organized. Whoop, there she is.
Robin is joining as well. We were just under the impression it started at 4:30, so that was our mistake.
No worries at all. No worries at all. Welcome. It's really good to see you.
I am happy to share our slides, and we can just kind of go with what we have, if that works for you guys.
That would be amazing. I think
okay, let me
to share.
We're gonna jump right in then, or do you want to?
Well, I mean, the other article that we were reading today was the Steve Cheekins article. So the one about drumming, in which he introduces a lot of the protocols around the drum, his own experiences of being disenfranchised from his culture as a youth and finding his way through drumming, and then his introduction to the 7 sacred teachings and how that has informed the way he works in the world, particularly as a social worker who works with at-risk men, or men who have, are struggling with addictions and that sort of thing. So I think we can certainly talk a little bit about that article if you'd like a couple of minutes to sort of collect your thoughts and arrive. I don't know if you had any responses to that article, Laura. Oh, we should probably introduce ourselves too at some point. I'm never good at this sort of thing. My apologies.
Well, we also just jumped on, so it was like,
I mean, I taught grade 8s to make art in high school, so you'd think I could actually navigate anything at this point. Why don't maybe Anna and Laura, Anna and Robin, you could introduce yourselves, and then Laura, you can introduce yourself as well. And then I know that everyone knows Nora because she's Nora. So, but Anna, why don't we start with you alphabetically?
Perfect. My name is Anna. I work at the Museum of Anthropology, and I am a settler on this land and also an American immigrant on this land. And I've been up here for about 7 years, and I know Nora and Shannon through school and work, I guess.
Perfect. Well, sticking with the alphabetical theme, let's go to Laura and then Robin.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I don't know anyone but Nora, so it makes sense to introduce myself. So I'm a PhD candidate in language and literacy in education. For my thesis, I will be researching lived experience of identity with regards to immigrant women teachers. I'm really excited to attend your workshop and learn a bit more. It's always part of, trying to be less of a perfect stranger, right? So yeah, I'm excited to be here and learn with and from you all. Yeah.
Thank you, Laura. Robin, you've gone off camera again, but I bet you'll come back.
I was just closing some closets. So I'm Robin Roberts, and I'm Haida Simpson and Squamish. I work for the Vancouver School Board, kind of transitioning maybe back into teaching again instead of going VP. Didn't really feel comfortable as a vice principal. So just figuring out how to do that. But I've been in Vancouver since 1999. And I've been an Indigenous educator since 2008 and taught grade 1 and grade 5 in between those times. And took Shannon's class early this year, right after the new year, or right at the new year. And yeah, so I'm pretty happy to be able to talk. I think we're going to go pretty informal. I think we're going off of our memory from that article. And I think that it's a visual essay, so maybe ask questions and figure out or weave our way through that. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for coming to join us. I feel like I've sort of fobbed off my workshop responsibilities a little bit on some students, but you did such a beautiful job. And I think that was the third or fourth time I taught that course. And it was really outstanding the way you thought with, together, and through that piece of art. So I would love to turn it over to you, and then maybe we can sort of tag any discussion about the Tikins article onto how you want to frame the Michael Nicolayagalanis article.
Perfect. I'm going to share screen. So as all of us are so used to hearing, I'm going to probably ask you in a second if you can see my screen.
Absolutely.
Of course. Is it going to work? Everybody can see that?
Perfect.
Stunning. We love when technology works. So you just heard us introduce ourselves, but Anna, Robin, and I are going to talk about Haida Manga by Michael Nicolayagalanis. First off, I wasn't sure if we needed to introduce who Michael was. Nora, do you want this? Should I gloss over this?
I wouldn't worry about it too much, because I think, I don't know, Laura, did you have a chance to look up his bio at all, or maybe you're not even worried?
No, I didn't look at that, to be honest. So yeah.
Well, I'm just going to note that Michael Nicolayagalanis is a very well-known and influential Haida artist. His practice represents a merging of two different cultures, so a Japanese manga style with his Haida artwork, and this like Haida iconography and Japanese visual culture. We're going to use to basically read his works. That was such a brief introduction that barely does justice to his work, but I think what's more important is actually talking about it and talking about this article that appears one way. I think you can probably read it in about 10 minutes flat if you just read the words, but I would argue that you could spend 10 years reading it and you wouldn't even read all of it. So really thinking through how you read something and thinking about that visual representation that's in it. So to start that off,
5 minutes. I think 5 minutes you could read it in. Sorry.
Probably 5 minutes. Robin's going to talk about form line.
To preface what Anna was saying, I think in the class we were only supposed to have a 40-minute discussion on the article, and we ended up taking up pretty much the whole class.
Which was absolutely fine, because you brought such richness to the conversation and actually introduced me to things that I had not seen or had not absorbed previously. So that was what made me so excited about your work. Teacher. Yeah.
Again, with what Anna, on top of what Anna was saying, Michael Nicolayagalanis was brought up in Haida Gwaii with carving culture. And so he was going to be carver too, I think, and he ended up breaking away from carving into more of a two-dimensional art form. And so in doing so, there are a lot of rules that are in Indigenous or Haida, what would be form line, and a lot of nations up and down the coast will call this kind of art style Haida art, and it's wrong. But you have the box, and this is his artwork called Deconstructing and Subverting the Form Line. So deconstruction of the box, and you can see the form line there. It was coined by somebody named Bill Holm, who is a he studied the rules of the artwork and all the different forms that make up the artwork. So there's, you could see ovals, circles, ovoids, U shapes, and different kinds of S forms or split U's and things like that. And learning too from the different artists up and down the coast now, or like different weavers or artists. I just learned that the split U was really a flicker feather. So it's just a feather that was a chief, like from a chiefly bird, because the feathers were so hard to come by. So whenever they do the feather in chilkat weaving, it's actually a flicker feather. And that was from William White. So talking to him a couple of weeks ago, he was talking about how that was. But back to the form line, you can see here how he deconstructs form line, and is going from the main use of form line, and then kind of becomes abstracting the meaning and working towards a different meaning that kind of comes with the form line. You can see his kind of playful trickster nature in his design, where these could look like different, like if you look, I don't want to give the idea away, but if you want to take a look for a couple of seconds and kind of see what might be happening in the image itself. What do you think, Anna?
Well, I love that we're taking something, like, for me, it really feels like unpacking something. Like you have this big image right here. All of a sudden now you're extracting a meaning from just one piece of it. Next thing you know, like I love to do like any kind of meaning. So now we've turned this part upside down. And then at the end we get to like, as long as it feels relevant. And I think that relevant is also dependent on like whose perspective. Like is it the reader? Is it the artist? Is it yeah, like that's kind of how I read it when I'm looking across at it. And I also just think come the end, it becomes this almost like playful imagery with the bang, with the like almost like sparkles, reminds me of like stars in space. And it really like changes the way you're like looking at that image to that first one.
And I think, I mean, we kind of saw something like this later on in the essay, in the actual essay, with the two circles and the beak that points up. There's a bit of cheekiness that goes on in his work.
If I could add something. So again, I'm an outsider, but I love these four images. And for me, just by looking at them, it's like zooming in, right? And then narrow focus. And then we go towards the last two on the right-hand side of the screen. And for me, it's like meaning making that each of us extracts, right? And that for sure is like the bang, it's different. Right, so I think that's one of the beauties of visual art, right? Multimodal. It's based on our background, our lived experience, and so on. That is the meaning making that we make, right? So yeah, I love the four images. Thanks for sharing.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's the phenomenological experience too, that we are bringing what we have to this moment and looking at whatever the artist has that they're bringing to this moment. So I love that, Laura. Thank you.
Yeah. And like, when you look at it, you can see the Haida form line and there's specific rules, but when you look deeply, you can see that he's actually placing eyes in different things in different areas to actually show that like there's actually supposed to be in specific spaces. Like these eyes on the first, like the abstract meaning part where you can actually see the eyes looking, it's actually looking upwards. And for me, the view is this way, but probably that way because I'm mirrored, right?
Right.
but you can see them looking up, but usually they're like right centered and they have to be a specific like 1/3 distance in between the top and 2/3 distance down the bottom. And so there's those little playfulness. And so he's subverting the meaning because of, you know, Bill Home and actual the Haida itself themselves, or the people who have started the form line, created these rules, and these are specific rules within the nation, and each nation would have its own rules of being able to do the artwork. So Haida would be a specific kind of ovoid or a specific kind of U shape, and a specific kind of differences where the layers would go. And so, and with the Haida, it's like 2 or 1/3, 2/3 on the bottom. Like it's about the negative space as well as the positive space.
Right.
And Shannon mentioned phenomenology, and my eyes were all big because that's on one of the frameworks I've been fascinated with. And that's not just a framework for doing research, it's also like literature and so on. And I think that when I'm looking at these 4 images, it's like taps into our own consciousness, right? And again, it takes us back to visual and how each of us interprets it. So yeah, phenomenology for sure.
That's great.
That's such an important point, because what we're going to do when we start talking about the actual pages is like a phenomenological like inquiry. Like we're going to think about like, what do we see and what do we think, and like really start delving into that. I just want to like note one more thing, is I think the contrast between a statement about Bill Home and the way in which these scholars are describing form line, and the way in which they're working this like abstracted skeletal innards, and like that removal of almost like meaning to me when you think of like skeletal innards, and how when you're looking at these 4 images, though, it feels like you're putting so much life into it. And I think just thinking about that way of like looking at it is really important. Also, when we talk about this idea of like extracting meaning, I think that meaning is also that story, like we're extracting that storytelling. So our next note is just a brief moment to talk also about non-Western storytelling. I have this quote from Yankalanis that says, "So I wanted to create this graphic interpretation of old narratives, not just old narratives, but maybe get down to some of the messages embedded in these narratives and parables. And I want to extract them and compare them to stories we need to hear in a living moment." And what you see below is the cover image of Red, a Haida manga, which, Laura, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but this is probably one of his most famous books. And what you see beside it is it's like a regular picture book that you flip through the pages, but if you were to take all of the pages out, so that each of these squares is 6 pages, there's over 100 pages total, it produces this massive image, and in it you see all of the form line connects throughout it. And it's not just one story that you can read, like each page, but you can also read it all together as its own story. Robin, did you want to touch on what we were talking about earlier about like that negative positive space? And
Do we want to wait, or do we want to do it now? One thing that I listened to him, or I saw him speak on YouTube on one of the, either a TED talk or some sort of gallery talk, and he was really advocating for people to just tear the books apart and do this and play with it like this. And then of course people would have to buy the book again.
Clever marketing scheme, Michael. Clever marketing scheme.
But I mean, the other thing about form line design is, like I just said earlier, that there's importance placed between negative and positive shape. So the form line itself is a positive, and also all the other colored shapes within the form line, but the negative space in a lot of, especially in Haida, looks like it's not being used at all. But with the negative space, it's actually just as important as it is for the positive shape, because without the negative shape, the positives can't really do what they're supposed to do. And then things start looking jumbled and off. And in that book that I got, the writing, what is it called? The Seriousness of Play. Later on, he has another visual essay in there about his take on comics in the gutter. And so the gutter itself is like I guess the borders within the comic. And so having comics in that kind of like linear form for him is colonial, and the spaces that are happening, or those empty spaces that happen within, say, the form line, is almost like his idea of indigenous spaces, where they are, even though that they look empty, they're being used. So just like in a forest, they're empty but being used. Like the examples of use is through things like modified trees and different ways of using plant and animals, or plant life for the people, for medicine. And so in his work, he wants to, I think, utilize all of the space within the form lines so that there's no takeaway or no terra nullius that happens within that claim of ownership within the artwork. And so he says that emptiness is almost like terra nullius within kind of the art form.
I have a question, Robin, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the negative and positive shapes, and then you added that empty spaces stand for like indigenous spaces. And I'm looking at this beautifully colored image here on the right of the screen. I'm sorry, I don't see any negative and positive shapes. I just see colors. And if you could just help me distinguish what stands for negative and what stands for positive.
Yeah. Have you seen any crest design or anything like that of Northwest Coast artwork?
I've seen, yes.
Yeah, so you know like you can see the black lines in this one, that would be considered the main form line.
Yeah.
And then there would be colors of red, black, and other kind of maybe greens or blues and stuff like that within it, but there would always be white space in between the shapes. So the white shapes are what is negative shapes, but those negative shapes in the artwork are just as important as the main shapes, or all the other colored shapes.
That's interesting. Thanks so much. I see.
Yeah, like you can see all the white within these images. That's what would be considered the negative space.
Oh, I see. Thank you.
I recall when you presented this in class too, being really struck by the notion that the gutters, like the space that goes around each of the picture panes, is also the space where we make meaning. So in that phenomenological way, that's where we bring ourselves to the table, and that's where we negotiate our view of the world versus the artist's view of the world, and maybe even in combination with the story being told. So there's a lot of power in that. It's almost a space of, like, as you were saying with the forest, we rest between the trees. We don't walk through the trees. We walk, around the trees. And that's where our meaning, our relationships are founded. So I love that idea.
Is there a reason why these 4 images are black and white and not colorful?
I think that it's probably to show the main negative and positive shape. And then also probably, I think, because of the bang that happens in the 4th one, to show kind of, this is like a visual essay too as well, where you've got the deconstruction of a box and the cheeky person in the middle, kind of like form line, like just you can see his and then he's got like the 2, I don't know, I don't want to give it away, like he's got the 2 balls and the thing pointing up, and he's being cheeky. And then also like the big bang, or the like the moment of, I guess, creativity happening.
I just wanted to go back to something that Shannon mentioned with regards to phenomenology. So if the white spaces allow for, ourselves to, make meaning from a phenomenological standpoint, then I see a lot of positive qualities to the white shapes, the white spaces, right?
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah. And yeah, the negative is very important. And like Shannon said, the shapes that make up like the people are sometimes characters within the story that's being told. And so depending on what, like this would be, if it was a bentwood box. It would be the story of the family that they're making a bentwood box for. And so, but if it's a crest or a crest that tells a story, they would have different characters within the crest that would tell the story. So you might have, you know, a main figure of a raven, but because he's telling a, or even a killer whale, he would have the story of the people that happen, or part of the story within it, to show the different story within it.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Yeah.
I think like touching on all of that and what Shannon said as well is one of the things that we've shown previously. I took the videos out just because I didn't want this to go on for too long, but Michael has an incredible TED Talk where he speaks to storytelling and his perspective on it. And one of the notes that he makes is he reminds us that like art opens all of us up to the connections of life, but also the meaning of ourselves and the space in between each other. And I think that idea of like the space in the gutters and outside the images or in between things is really important to keep in mind as we look at each page individually, but also think of maybe how each page leads into the next.
Yeah. Well, and on top of that, like everything's just starting to come back. Sorry, Anna, if I keep cutting you off. But I mean, on top of what Shannon was saying about the different stories within each part of the crest design, in those gutters, he's filling up those spaces now with story that would be told within the form line normally, but with the kind of not the typical traditional lens of Indigenous storytelling. So he's utilizing the form line, but subverting the meaning of the form line by putting in story that is a little bit more of a different tradition.
I think it's really important to think about the fact that he veers away from the balance that is fundamental to most Northwest Coast and Coast Salish design. And that's part of what that positive and negative space idea is about. The positive space, gives us a place to balance, or pardon me, the negative space gives us to balance the positive space, like how we actually, the positive space is what we see, the image, and then the negative space is what surrounds us, but that is necessary to create balance. I've just put a link in the chat to the TED Talk that Robin and Anna were referring to. And it's definitely worth having a look at, because I think that's where he articulates that, where is it that we make meaning when we're looking at art? And I think in particular, this graphic style of art, which is also a little bit well outside of certainly Haida convention. So, but I'm also conscious of time. So we've got about 45 minutes left. And so let's push through and see what happens.
Perfect. Then I think the best place to start is with page 1 and page 2. So obviously Robin and I have just said a whole bunch. I'm curious, maybe Shannon, Laura, Nora, if I were to, oh, it kind of rhymes. If I were to ask you guys, like, maybe like, what's the first thing you see when you look at these 2 pages? And also, who do you think is talking and who is saying what? Or kind of maybe first 2 questions to think about as we look at this.
Is there any iconography or any things that you would kind of might consider symbology within?
I mean, absolutely. And I think that we go, that takes us to those 5 phenomenological questions. The first one being, what does this remind you of? Well, actually, the first one being, what are we looking at? And the second one, what does this remind you of? And I think I'm actually a person that really resists graphic novels and comics. I find them to be really, really too complex for me. And my little brain just gets like overloaded quite easily, which is funny because I think a lot of people really, they love that. And especially, if there's any kind of neurodivergence, it's an attractant. But for me, I just feel like, oh, it makes me tired. But, I think there's some, so that's all I'll say.
I'm with Shannon on this one. I mean, I love visuals, but when it comes to like, okay, so I gotta go back to this and read it again and look at it again to see what does it mean. And now you were asking about images, and I think Anna mentioned the more I look at these two images, the more I think, oh, there's other things I see, and there's more and more. And then I think it also depends on the moment. I looked at these 2 days ago, and I'm looking at these again, and I see different things, right? So.
Well, that was my first comment in the presentation. Was I read this in like 1 minute the first time and was like, Shannon, are you sure this is the essay that you're giving us? And I think I even messaged her or something like that, and was like,
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
and I was like, this is ridiculous.
Really? Yeah.
Really? Like we just read like 15-page papers or 20, almost 20 pages leading up to that. And so this was so little, but then as Anna and I kept going through it, I was like, oh, there's this, oh, there's that. And I think for me, I have a privilege of being able to do a museum tour in Prince Rupert and being able to know different things about Haida or Northwest Coast culture. Well, I mean, the museum tour in Prince Rupert was a Tsimshian tour, but they're very close neighbors and share a lot of different ways of being or utilizing of resources. So like that's something that I'm able to read into because it's something that I've kind of become inner over the last 20-30 years.
Also, I know for me, like exactly the same. I was so naive the first time I read it, and both Robert and I were texting, and we were like, "So short. Is this right?" And then hours and hours and hours of Zooms later, I think we could still keep talking about it. But I want to draw our attention to something that's at the very bottom. You'll see his signature with his like signature fish, and he says a Haida manga mural. And for me, that's one of the first things I picked up on. So for the rest of this slideshow, rather than reading it maybe linearly, like one page at a time, how you do in the PDF, you'll see more than one page next to each other. And I think for me, seeing that like really shifts the way I read it. Yeah, and I just think like that was one of my first things that I noticed when I looked at that page, was this like specific use of like not visual essay, but manga mural. And I think the other thing is the way in which both like words and pictures, my question is like, do they fit the design of the form line, or does the form line maybe fit the words and pictures? Like I know where it says like find a stream, and it fits so perfectly in that circle, or just looking at different pieces. It just makes me wonder like what came first. Yeah.
Well, and now that we've seen the red and how how that all fits together, you immediately get a sense of, oh, I see these lines are cut off. Are we going to see the same thing at the end? So there's now we have some familiarity and there's some anticipation. Let's blaze through. Let's see what's next.
Perfect. Okay, for some reason,
we want to talk about, or we can maybe talk about some of the iconography at the end.
Sure.
Yeah, maybe like on that second to last one.
Or the one where we just kind of bring it all together.
Yeah. Perfect. So yeah, so we've got the next few pages. Obviously the story continues to move. This one, I think you can really clearly see. This is like the first one where like the pages really start to come together. And of course, as we get to the end, as both Shannon and I alluded to, all these pictures are going to come together to one image. And I guess my first question, like maybe Laura, for you, does it change it to look at the essay in this way?
Yes, I wish I had seen that at the very beginning. Like as a framework, right, would have helped me. Yeah, for sure. That's wonderful.
It's definitely not perfect. Like I'm using PDFs to turn to JPEGs that are cropped. So proportions, I'm sure if I took the paperwork and we printed it out, it would line up even better. But
I
think
feel
it's
like
really
without these 4 images, without like what I refer to as a framework, I kind of got lost, and like, again, phenomenology. You just start thinking and it brings back all kinds of memories. Like as a little kid, I would just buy my own books and like Japanese illustrated books, right? And then there's so much. But if you were to start with the 4 images, with the framework, I think that would have kept me a bit more on track. So yeah, it all comes together in a way.
One of my favorite things about this conversation has been thinking about the negative and positive space that was brought up in the very beginning, and how Laura was asking, what is the negative and positive space? As a genuine question. And it got me thinking, because as we look, the negative space is really where all of the action is. And the only real like negative space in my head, the peaceful part of it, is the black line. So it's interesting to see how that sort of back and forthing happens as well.
I love that like subversion of space, or like that reimagining what is the meaning and like, where are we telling the story. I think that's why it's also so important to see it as one image, is that we're now looking at like more than one story maybe being told in this imagery. Something else that like we didn't go through them individually, but there's so many tiny details as well. And to think that if you only saw this image, you might not notice some of the tiny details. And so thinking through like just like the books that are on the library shelf are different homages to different influences in like Michael's life. And so how you have to look at it so many different ways. Like I think that's why that like bottom image of the 4 images of the box is also important, because you wouldn't be able to picture the whole image if we just looked at each page, but you also may not be able to read all the details if we just look at the big image. Or that same if we just looked at the positive space, or we just looked at the negative space, and like how important like looking at all these different perspectives is, and that each of us is coming with our own perspective as well, like a different way to read it. I learned so much because I was privileged enough to be partnered with Robin, who has so much knowledge, of course, of hydroculture, and there's so many things that he pointed out that I wouldn't have ever known or understood the symbolism of.
Yeah, like we have the water and then the cedar boughs, and just pointing that out is like a huge cultural implication within the story that he's telling, like the importance of water and how it's cross-cultural up and down the coast. And I don't know if we assumed that this was the same Ellen, but we assumed that it was Ellen, what's her last name again?
Neil.
Ellen Neal, who was a very important artist who helped keep Indigenous carving alive through the time when the potlatch ban was happening. And so her idea of water is same as his idea of water, but then knowing that the cedar bough is a healing property of cleansing, and through cedar brushing and everything like that, and just all the different little things that kind of go through with elder knowledge and the transfer of knowledge and how you transfer knowledge within the culture. And then how, because it's a story of him becoming, and that's kind of like when you hit the wave, you kind of end up just getting caught within the wave and have to move within the wave. So that's him learning to become the artist that he is. And so in what ways did the culture help him become the artist that he is?
And isn't that a good metaphor for our learning as well? That the wave catches us, and then we if you resist it, you run the risk of drowning. But if you learn to go with it, if you learn to, thinking about materials, if you learn to work with the material, you work with the wave, you work with the water, then you eventually, find yourself washed up at a beach somewhere. But you're working with things and moving in the same direction. So, and I'm glad you pointed that out about Ellen Neal, because I was going to ask you to talk a little bit about iconography, because there are things too that we become conscious of, that as I'm an Indigenous person, but I'm not a Haida person. So I have some insider knowledge, but I don't have all of the insider knowledge. If you're coming completely from outside of this world or of an Indigenous kind of perspective at all, then there might be even less for you to grapple with in some ways, but perhaps there's more for you to grapple with in others. Maybe there are other things that are very familiar, things you might, and that's where we always ask, like, what does this remind you of? And in fact, for whatever reason, I just was watching parts of, I remember why. I was learning about some Russian film theory, and I was watching a little bit of The Seventh Seal by Ingmar Bergman. And so the image right in the very middle that's got the little guy with a hood makes me think of that film and of the notion of grappling with death. And I think if death is the opposite of creativity, then to have that in the center of the image, whether that's my association or something that MNY is bringing forward, that there's another thing that we might start to deal with when we look at this work, and a phenomenological example of here's what I'm bringing.
I think like also, oh, sorry, go ahead, Robin.
Yeah, I was just going to be like, that's amazing.
Yeah, I like totally agree. I think also you see him grappling with all the same questions as you move throughout it that we are. Like, I'm just like re-looking at it and like thinking of these questions of like that positive and negative space and like figures as well. And like you see somebody like pushing against these boundaries with their finger, like somebody in the essay is questioning what these lines are, and you see this idea of like the ink of an empty idea fills the empty chamber and is focused and directed by, but then it's a question of like, who is it and who is making those decisions? And you get this idea that like, I am the brush, and all of a sudden this line has become like a hand holding the brush, and it's almost like a circle back at the beginning. But I think it's interesting to see is like the identity of like who we are and what we're doing, and thinking about like wave and that wave that like propels us forward, but it like, how do we resurface out of the wave, but also how do we use it? And also the principles of water and flow, and like how these pages literally flow together. I always think about it, and like you literally see water like spilling over from one page to the next. Yeah, so many things.
And then also the idea around elders or people who have influenced us. So like our teachers are elders. So he starts off with an elder, and then like Anna says, previous artists like Alan Neal, and then even artists that are pop artists, musical artists, and then also his book stars, the ones that have all the theory within the books. And so it's all his becoming and what influences us as artists or are becoming.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, go on.
For me, the last sentence, I am a brush, for me, that just takes me to new materialism, which is the framework I'm using to research identity. And so new materialism that, puts on equal footing humans and non-humans. And that's just that simple sentence right there. I am a brush, for me, that's what it is. New materialism, we are equal with what's around us, humans and non.
Yeah, and that also brings back to like the idea around muscle memory and the extension of ourselves too as well. Like the brush is now him, or he's the brush because it's now a part of him.
And I mean, that middle question is, so what does any of this have to do with me? And I think when I read that, like, is the me is the reader, or is the me him? And I think the me is both. Like, what does this have to do with me? Like, I think that really sums up this and the end of it as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's what I was trying to get. I just took a screenshot because I know that you two did the work together of getting this image complete. So I wanted to be able to share that. But I think that's what I was getting at when I was talking about the wave too, that's part of that, we are all related, we are all connected. And when we resist what is around us, or when we resist the way things want to be or the way things are in the world, that's when we run into trouble. So I think this is just fabulous, very fabulous. Now I can't find the image that I just took, so I'll get that figured out behind the scenes. Please carry on.
Well, I think I know, like, you only have so much time and you have a whole article to talk about. I think that's our last slide. Yeah, it's not moving forward. So whether there's another or not, it's not going.
Maybe if you have any questions on any of the images, if there's like things that are happening within that you might have any questions about culturally, I don't know if that would help. Was there anything within it that you might have not understood or kind of needed a little bit more information about?
for me, it's not so much questions as it's like I'm thinking, and I just find it mind-blowing. And I really appreciate your discussion and the way you broke down things into, making it accessible and easy for us to understand. And I feel like this would be a good starting point, before teachers address indigeneity with their students. So I think this would be a really great way of just introducing the perfect strangers, right, to Aboriginal art. And
And then maybe even if we're sorry, go ahead.
The wide negative spaces, I'm just thinking about that. That's for me one of the main takeaways. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, like he talks about the ideas around terra nullius, which is the idea of why Europeans were allowed to take all the lands in Canada that weren't being used by Indigenous people. Wow. So he's equating that to the negative spaces that aren't being used. But also, how do we juxtapose something like this against some of the local knowledges? I think we're all in Vancouver or in the Vancouver area, Lower Mainland. So Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and beyond to Kwantlen or beyond there.
And you mentioned, Robin, transferring knowledge within, and I would add outside the culture, right? And I should add that while looking at this and reading, for me, the images, I was translating them into like literary devices, because that's something that I'm more familiar with, right? Like metaphor, alliteration, and analogy, right? And so listening to you and Anna explain some of these concepts was very helpful. It helped me see things differently, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So that maybe is a good point to transition into what are some of the tensions or the disparities that you found between thinking about this article and thinking about the Tikans article about drumming and the 7 sacred teachings. I don't know, and Anna and Robin, you have done such excellent service. You are welcome to stay and join us, but also if you need to, live your lives, you're also welcome to live your lives. But I would love to have you stay. It's completely up to you. But I'm definitely curious for you, Laura. That obviously the Tikans article was a little bit easier to read. Were there things that resonated for you in that work?
So yeah, now I of course I like this other one way more because it has so much more packed, right? But yes, drumming 101 was way easier to read. And although I love images, right, I found that way easier to read and to write. And there's something that he says, I knew that I wanted to be a drummer even back then, and there's a but, right? And then he tells us about how he got closer and closer to what he wanted to be. So perseverance, and that reminded me, I knew I wanted to be a teacher ever since, right? So there's always, like, when we read, how we relate to what we are reading, right? And the way he talks, the way he writes is just beautiful and simple. Relate to it, right? And I love that. His passion. That's what brought him to where he is, to where he has achieved.
Yeah, awesome. Go ahead, Robin, and then I see Anna's hand too.
And now that you explained that part, I think it started to come back to me because it's been a while since I read the article. But now I'm remembering how the idea of becoming was similar in both articles, where like his becoming was different from Yagalanis, but at the same time, the becoming was within the culture and the artwork, or with the artwork being drumming and the connection to the drum and to song and dance.
Yeah, lovely. And Anna?
I don't know actually give it to her anymore. But thank you guys so much. Yeah, I'm so sorry to have to leave.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. I sure appreciate your time, and you take good care. I'll run into you again.
Bye, everybody.
I might run off too. I mean, I don't remember much of the article, unless I don't know if there would be.
No worries. You've done service above and beyond the call of duty, and it's truly appreciated.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Good to see you all, and good to meet you, Laura. I don't know if we met before, but I think, yeah.
Listening to you, Anna and Robin. Thanks so much. Awesome. Did a great job. Thank you.
Take good care.
Bye.
Bye.
So then there were just a few of us left, and that's all right too. But to make the best use of your time, Laura, I wonder if there's anything that particularly about that Tikins article, or anything that you are thinking about or grappling with or wondering how you can make this work in your own teaching practice, in your own work.
So just using storytelling, that's everybody has got a story to tell, right? And how you can just let students be heard in the class by just listening to them, and that could take the form of a visual project, right? Now that we've seen the first part of the workshop, and I want to finish reading the book. So
Yeah, there's so much in there, and as I said, like it gets us away too from trauma narratives to narratives of success and survivance and artistry and creativity, and I think those are such important places to go. Darn it, there was something else I was going to say about the Steve Tikins article, but I cannot think of what it was.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to include in the resources, because I've already sent them off to Paven, but I'm going to add in that video of Tikins drumming that was because there's a really wonderful video of Tikins's drumming, and it was overlaid in the presentation in class with these sort of rhythmic circles that were playing out the rhythm, so you could see sort of the 7 circles or the 7 teachings as they played through in a really visual way that was quite good for my brain, because the visual is 100% what I function off of.
And I think so there's research that was done by a woman who is, I think she's currently the district vice principal of Indigenous education at the Vancouver School Board, Davida Marston. And when she did her research for her dissertation, she actually looked at the 7 sacred teachings. She also has a practice of drumming and making drums, and she assigned a color to each of the 7 sacred teachings. So if you think about the 7 colors in the rainbow, and then you think about these 7 sacred teachings, I think she also assigned a musical note to each of those teachings. So not quite the full 8 note range, but then when we start to see those things come together, there's this almost metaphysical element of thinking in interconnected ways, and back to that, the notion of the where the meaning happens and the spaces in between, and sometimes it's the relationship between the notes or the relationship between the colors where we really find the vibrancy and the thing that draws us into a work of art. So I'm delighted to hear that this was resonant for you, Laura, and that there's maybe something that you will be able to take away and work with or think about as you start your research, finish your dissertation, and then start your career, because the dissertation is just the beginning part, right?
Yeah. And just like the teacher to me is thinking, okay, so how I could use this article. So you could just write these words on the board: love, respect, humility, wisdom, courage, honesty, and then just have students brainstorm. And right there, they don't have to read the article, and then that could be the warm up, and then bring them to the article. So there's lots to do and lots to draw on.
Absolutely. And I think here it's right here. Whoa. There is this book about the 7 sacred teachings. So a wonderful picture book that's done by David Bouchard and Dr. Joseph Martin. And it goes through each of the teachings. And so that's also, a way to have a resource that carries these teachings in your classroom and is written by an Indigenous person. So when I use those especially in teacher education classrooms, I ask my students, what would it mean if every day, every lesson, every unit, you thought about those 7 teachings and what it might mean to practice education in those ways? What will that mean to your learners? What will it mean to you? Because we know as teachers too, we can have those days where you just feel like, should I not just be a barista or something? Like maybe maybe I need to change. But when we think about what our heart brings to teaching, and we get back in touch with what those values are, then I think we remember why we keep coming back day after day to keep doing that work.
For sure. Yes. 7 teachings, that also ties into mindfulness, right? And how to be able to be more present and connected with your authentic self. So, but that's more on a personal note, not so much what I would teach, but what I would take away, just my own learning.
Precisely. Well, I can share, the last thing I'll share is that one of the things, and I could not believe that in all of my considerable number of years, I had never thought about this before, but the 2 guys that presented the Tikins article in the class pointed out that in, Judeo-Christian traditions, there are the 7 deadly sins, which are thou shalt not things. And then these 7 sacred teachings are the sort of thou shall things. And I was gobsmacked that had never occurred to me before, but so good and so powerful. And especially when we start to think about ontologies and epistemologies, like, what does that say, right? So how did this thing where we're always talking about the negative and the thing you shouldn't do get elevated above this thing that is always talking about what you should do, what's right to do, how to be a good human in the world. Yeah, so those are some interesting questions for me. But I'm going to, Laura, if there's anything else that you want to put on the table, or Nora, I'm quite happy to stay and chat, but I'm also conscious that we heard a lot about Haida manga, and that there's only 3 of us, and poor Laura's kind of on the spot as a result of that. So.
No, I'm really grateful, and I'm happy I had a chance and time to attend your workshop. It's just so there's lots for me. I'm thinking there's lots to to change in terms of how I create my own curriculum. The drummer makes drum, the teacher also creates right learning material, and it's just so beautiful. So yeah, thank you so much. I've learned a lot. And I'm thinking now of the 7 teachings and 7 C's. That right there is a great research project to just
yeah. Exactly. I've been thinking about that a lot since that class. I'm thinking, and I went to Catholic school for 12 years in Saskatchewan. So how that never went in. It's a little embarrassing, frankly, and we're recording this, right? Great. So now
that's the beauty of coming to learn with and from others, right? There's new perspectives. So that's
exactly. And I think we're also ready for things when we're ready for them, and we see them when we're ready to see them. So but Nora, I am so grateful to you for organizing all of this, to you and Payvand. And it's been absolutely delightful. And Laura, you've been a total trooper, given that you were kind of on the spot the whole time. So really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Shannon. I loved your workshop for sure. Thank you.
I wish you all the best in your work. And Nora, I'm sure we'll connect again. And I wish you all the best in your work as well.
Thank you so much, Shannon and Laura. I so appreciate this.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone. Have a lovely evening. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.